Okay, so you're here for the Oxford University Press presentation. Before we get into that, I do want to... Now, I had to find out today who the people were from this area, so I'm going to apologise now if I offend anyone by mispronouncing either of these. But I do want to acknowledge the Giabel and Jarawar people. Is that sort of right? Giabel and Jarawar. Okay. And recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. All right. The workshop's pretty much got 4 parts. We don't actually move through it quite in the order that I was originally given, for reasons that will come fairly obvious as we go along. There's some bits which we'll skip over, but you've got some of the slides that I'll skip over, you've got in your package, and you can have a look at those anyway. The other thing is that I'm assuming most people by this stage, particularly if you're looking at a Year 12 book, or sorry, a Unit 3 and 4 book, if you're looking at a Unit 3 and 4 book, I'm assuming most of you know what's in the syllabus by now. Can I make that assumption? Nobody's new to the syllabus? Okay, so some of the background on the syllabus I'll sort of acknowledge rather than talk about in any great detail, and that'll give us time to talk about any other issues. Because obviously while part of the intention is to tell you about what's in the book, it's also about hopefully sharing some ideas about how to implement the syllabus and issues that are arising with the syllabus, and give you that opportunity as well. I don't know whether you're aware of who the authors were, but there's Kelly McGraw, who's at QUT. She's also Treasurer of ETAC. There's me, standing before you, and if anyone doesn't know me, I've been in education for 36 years, taught in both state and independent schools. My last 8 years was at Church Years Head of English, and the last 12 or so years I've actually been doing just work with teachers in schools. I've been literacy work in particular. I've been working with across the curriculum at the moment. It's interesting having a look at the literacy demands of other syllabuses, not just English. I've also just submitted my PhD about a month ago. Yes, so that's all. The examiners now having whatever happens with them happening. Yes, thank you for that. And then Sophie Johnson, who has been around for a long time. One of the interesting things about Sophie is she taught the International Baccalaureate, and that's been able to feed in a little bit to what we've been able to think about with external exams as well. She's also an ETAC. I'm Vice President, Kelly's Treasurer, and Sophie's also on the Management Committee. Sophie's also now working on the in at QCAA, and I have to make it really, I think she'd probably like me to make it really clear that she actually hasn't had anything to do with the book since about since January, the day before that she went and worked for QCAA, and she's having no conversations with us about the book at the moment because she's actually in the process of writing questions for the external exam for next year. They're getting themselves 12 months ahead. Yeah. So, but I'll say more about that as we go along. Okay, probably don't need to tell you this is a big change. Anyone finding it not a big change? No? Okay, great. Well, we can move on. And look, probably the biggest thing for us is the external exam. It's interesting. I've just come back from National Council for AATE down in Adelaide on the weekend. And it's interesting looking at how this has affected some of their PD offerings, because at one state, all their PD offerings are actually tied to various aspects of their external exams for the whole year. and this state doesn't run a state conference either. So let's hope that doesn't happen in Queensland. But we've got a really, I think where we're lucky, to be honest, is we've got a different structure from what all the other states have, where they actually have more than one exam, and they were actually really surprised to hear that all our kids have to do for an external exam is write one interpretive essay based on a novel or play. Because down south they do critical reading stuff, they do some imaginative writing stuff of, the QCS sort of variety. So that they actually do a whole lot of different components to their exams, and often 2 papers, not just one. So I think really we've been pretty lucky, and I think although I'm still in 2 minds about the external exam, I have to say at least I think every kid was going to write an analytical essay at some stage in year 12, and it's probably one they would have done under test conditions anyway. So for me, it's probably the best worst case scenario. Anyway, all right. So obviously you know that there's 4 units, and we're not allowed to talk about year 11 and 12 anymore. So units 1 and 2, that's what the first of the books covered. One of the things which we liked about writing this book, I have to say, is that we had a lot more flexibility in what we could offer. We've since discovered that a lot of teachers are using the prescribed text list for year 12 for their for units 3 and 4 for their units 1 and 2 course as well. I can understand why people are doing that, but I think from my perspective, I wouldn't have done that, because I would have liked to have used things beyond the list as well. And that's what we did a bit. Tried to have a bit of tried to do things which were a bit more imaginative and interesting in book 1, but still preparing kids very much for what would happen in book 2. I'll forget to say this later, so I'll say it now. One of the things which we encouraged Oxford to put in to both these books, which they agreed to, is there is an index in the back, which a lot of English textbooks haven't had, but that caters for the fact that you might not want to do, say, the environmental unit that I wrote for chapter 3 for this, but you might want to do stuff on ethos, logos and pathos, and those persuasive techniques and that are actually covered in chapter 3. And how do you know that? Because you'll be able to look up the index and find that. So all of the concepts that kids need to learn are all embedded in the book, and the index will help you find that, even if it's not entirely obvious just from the title of chapters. And that'll be the same with the next book as well. So this is obviously the interest now as we're going forward, while people are still teaching the units 1 and 2. How are units 1 and 2 going, by the way? Everyone happy with them?
Yeah, going well, I think.
Yeah? Kids are coping? More importantly, teachers are coping?
Yes, just.
Just?
Well, no one's been taken away to the funny farm yet, so
Yeah,
that's a positive.
that is a positive. Lots of conversations, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously there's this is what the external exams link to, and we'll talk about that as we go along. Okay, so one of the things which people never pay attention to, of course, when they're reading syllabus, because they want to go straight to what they need to teach, and I'm not saying you people did that, I'm sure you've all read these pages, but there is a bit of a rationale at the beginning of the syllabus, and I just want to draw your attention to this, because this for me was really important. And that is, the framework for the subject's interrelated objectives is informed by an understanding of the relationship between language, text, purpose, context and audience, and how these relationships shape meaning and perspectives. And anyone who's been around for a while, unfortunately like I have by now, will know that that's the context, text or language and use model, and that's been in Queensland syllabuses since 1987. So one of the things that I was pretty determined to make sure happened in our books was that the language and use model was up front in the books and informed the way that we approach the teaching of language through the rest of them as well. And I think that's, once again, having come back from talking to people from, key people from every state on the weekend, I think it's something which we have unique to the way we do in English in Queensland, which I think it's worth holding on to. In fact, a couple of states at least were quite, let's say, not entirely on board with the language and use model. Yes.
So what do they do?
That's a very good question.
Oh.
But it was very clear that they ignore anything in the Australian curriculum. They just continue doing what they think they want to do. Yeah. And that's been the diagram that's, that looks, that we've used for the language and use model or context text model, and that you'll find up front in the chapters you've got there. You'll find up front in chapter 1. So in chapter 1, one of the things I've done is to actually go through and actually talk about the language and use model, do a bit of summary of it. There's a much more detailed outlining of the context text model and activities associated with it in chapter 1 of book 1. All right, but there's a summary, at least in at the beginning of chapter 2, and that you can either use to guide the way that you're, talking through the whole unit. It's something that could be done as a standalone little bit at the beginning of the course. For example, at the beginning of term 4, for example, or however you want to use it. It's not meant to be a part of the course. It's a bit of additional information. Yeah. I've just said that. So chapter 1, which is one of the chapters that you've got, I'm actually really happy with how it turned out because what we've done is we've reviewed the language and use model. What we've also done is provide study skills for English linked to the cognitive verbs. So I'm just going to do one example here, but most people, I assume, would be familiar with the writing process. Which has been around for donkey's years, the writing process. And what I've tried to do is to take each stage of the writing process, this is on page 15 of the booklet, and then under each of the stages of the writing process, tried to just pull apart what the cognitive verbs associated with that stage of the writing process are most likely to be. So that you're not just saying to kids, okay, in English you need to be able to evaluate, but if you're doing a piece of writing, here is where you might be doing evaluation in the writing process. And there's, to go along with that, you won't be too surprised here, there's also a reading process as well, and suggestions about where the cognitive processes fit with that. All the cognitive processes are defined too, and we've defined them usually using close to what the QCAA definition is, but in some cases we thought the QCAA definition wasn't going to fit into a small space, so we might have adapted it slightly for that, but still maintains the same thing. And what we've also done with this writing process is then for the various writing tasks, including the external exam, we've adapted that or provided an adaptation of it for that particular task. So, for example, for the external test, there's a writing process with suggested times attached to it. So how long to spend on each part of the writing process. And then the other thing that you'll find in chapter 1, which, I've just said that, which I think is useful, is the reading frames. Now, this is a little bit out of order just because the way things would fit on the slide, but I think one of the really useful things which Kelly did, and it was based on some work from New South Wales, where she'd come from originally, was she developed these frames for when kids are reading. So if you're reading a text, you think about the text in terms of the personal frame, the structural frame, the cultural frame, and the critical frame. And in the margin next to questions we pose, for example, we've tried to put a little coding in what frame we're most in at this particular moment and what frame you should apply as students when you're thinking about this question. And of course, the point that we're trying to make to kids is that in order to be a good reader, you need to be doing all of these things in a fairly integrated way, but there might be an emphasis on one thing at one particular time. Now, the reason I've spent a little bit of time talking about that is about the various frameworks we've set up is that I think Kelly, Sophie and I all had a pretty strong belief that it's no good giving kids the abilities to just say, analyse The Great Gatsby. Okay, it's easy to help kids understand what The Great Gatsby is, send them off to Spark Notes or whatever, they'll find out what The Great Gatsby is all about. What we've tried to do is the harder thing of setting up some transferable, consistent frameworks that kids can apply when they're reading and writing and, of course, speaking or producing multimodal texts, etc. And then we've used those frameworks all the way through both books in the series. Does anyone have any questions about... Oh, I should say something more about Chapter 1 in a minute. Does anyone have any questions about those and the frameworks we used at all? And the other thing that... Sorry, I probably didn't wait long enough there, but anyway, you can ask me in a minute. The other thing that is in that first chapter, as I said, is tips on studying, particularly for senior English. So what I did was actually did some a scan of the research, pulled out some of the main findings on study skills, and tried to write a chapter that would help kids set up good study skills for themselves. And we've also tried to acknowledge the fact that some kids, aren't all going to be nice, white, middle-class kids with a little office of their own and, boards and all the rest of it, and try to give them some options if that's not, their situation as well. So that's in there as well, and does time management and setting up a study space and all sorts of things as you go through there. So that's the other thing that first chapter does, which is why I say it's a bit of a standalone chapter that you can use in a variety of different sorts of ways. All right, now obviously then there's units 3 and 4 that we have to teach, and of course unit 3 is split up into 2 topics, topic 1 and topic 2. I'm assuming, like most people I'm talking to around the state, you're starting unit 3 in term 4?
Yeah.
Everyone's starting unit 3 in term 4? If you're not, I'll just let you know, pretty much everyone is. So you might want to, have a bit of a think about that. But the other thing that has been coming up, though, is that there seems to be a bit of variety in whether people are doing topic 1 or topic 2 first, though. So who's doing topic 1 first? One school. So topic 2 is the main one people are looking at doing first. So doing IA2 first, yeah. That also seems to be a pretty common sort of thing. And I'm sure we'll come back to this later, but one of the things that Oxford's going to make sure is available is the material you'll need to teach topic 1 or 2 will be available by term 4. Maybe in digital form only by then, but that'll definitely be available. So in terms of what we've done, chapter 2 in the new book, chapter 2 in the new book is going to be an overview chapter, and that's one that you can use to give an overview of the concepts that are going to be needed for that particular topic. And then what we've done is we've had to, this was a bit more difficult for us because we had to make some guesses about what people might use or what people, might be interested in using. But what we've ended up doing is, based on the syllabus options, we've also offered 3 suggestions of things that you might do. So, for example, the chapter that I wrote for that section was looking at adaptation, which is one of the choices you've got in the syllabus. And that was based, though, on Sherlock, which is the BBC series, which is one of the prescribed books, or prescribed texts, I should say. And I've done the first episode of the Sherlock series compared to the original Conan Doyle short story, A Study in Scarlet. Now, although one of the things that I will emphasise a couple of times is that we've had to make, we can't guess what everyone's going to do. In fact, some of the feedback the Oxford staff are getting is that there's pretty much not a lot of common books that people are doing across the state, so it would have been impossible to write something that covers everything. But what we have tried to do is, as much as we can, to write them so that you can either use the activities and the resources with that particular book or text, or you can use use what's in the text as models for what the kids might do otherwise. And one of the things that I set up, for example, for chapter 6, which I think will be really useful, and I've been wanting to do it for a while, and this was my excuse to do it. I don't know whether... No, you don't have that chapter here. But in the toolkit, I've actually put a table which compares how narration, character, setting, plot and theme is conveyed in written texts and visual texts, moving and spoken. So you can make direct comparisons. So if you want to look at character, obviously with character you might look at, say, attributes in adjectives that are used to describe the character. In visual text, it might be the clothes they're wearing, for example. So it allows kids to have a little framework where they can make direct comparisons between the texts and how the characters are constructed in different types of texts. And you could either use one column or the other, or both if you were doing something comparative. Yeah, so we've tried to do a lot of that sort of thing. In terms of IA1, which is the public writing, let me just think. So I should have looked at this before I came in. IA1, that's the comparative one, isn't it? Yeah. Yes, okay. So, sorry, I just had to check there for a minute. So we actually, once again, made a bit of a call about what we might suggest, and we've with what all the time what we do is try to not be, we've deliberately not been too prescriptive, because we don't want to be saying to people this will get you through endorsement with QCAA. So there was that issue for a start. We didn't want to get us or Oxford in trouble in that regard. But we also wanted to give some options and just suggest to people some ways they might do things. Now, I have to say we didn't specifically do a literary essay for that, which a lot of people seem to be doing, but then I've been talking to a couple of schools in another capacity about what is the literary essay. But one of the things that I sort of convinced the other two, which I still think was a pretty good way to go, and this is in the final chapter you've got on page 5, that so it'll be that page there, so it's in the 7.2 section towards the back. So Callie was pretty keen in terms of the mode for it to be a blog, because she was pretty keen to promote something sort of hip and groovy and all the rest of it. Most teachers we're coming across aren't too excited about the blog idea, but what I suggest is, or my very strong belief, something from my systemic functional background, I'm pretty keen to make a point of, is that a blog isn't a genre. That a blog is a medium, and you can use pretty much any genre you want within the medium of the blog. So what I suggested we do, because there has to be an analytical component in this, whatever the piece is that the kids do for this, I suggested we do a compositional analysis as a blog entry. And a compositional analysis is where you basically analyse the features of a text without having to go too much into what the meaning is. Okay, the main purpose of the interpretive style analytical essay is to talk about what the meaning is. This is more about being able to pull apart texts. It's also recognised as a stepping stone genre into the interpretive style of analytical essay. So it seemed to me that if teachers wanted something that would help prepare kids directly for that, this might be a genre which might be useful. And as a part of that, I also wrote a compositional analysis based on Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1. So it's it was based on text which I assume the kids would, even now, I know Harry Potter's probably getting a bit old school for some of our kids, but something that most kids would know something about, and most teachers, I'm assuming, would know something about as well, and trying to model how they could do that. Now, even if you weren't interested in the blog style, which I've done in here, obviously you could talk to the kids in terms of the context text model of, okay, how could we modify this to suit a more formal sort of situation? So it's a piece that can provide a model for what you're doing, but even if it's a bit more informal than what you want, it actually provides a nice teaching tool for, something already prepared there, of the length which the syllabus recommends, by the way, that they can use for their piece as well. Any questions about Unit 3, or that part of Unit 3? Just keep an eye on the time. Oh, yeah, good. And then Unit Topic 2 is much more straightforward, of course, which is probably why most people are starting with that, I suspect, in Semester 4. And it's pretty familiar, I suppose, too, because it's a persuasive spoken that's going to come out of it. Obviously, that one is looking at the issue in the media. The issue we chose to focus on was mass surveillance, because it is a pretty important topic, but it very much can be used as sort of, if kids are have to look for their own articles and that. And so what's in that, once again, is a model for how they can go about analysing an issue. Yes, it might not be, in fact, you probably don't want it to be the issue that they're specifically going to do. The articles we've chosen are at the moment recent articles, but by the time they get their hands on it, they'll be out of date, so they can't use these articles or anything. And we've also set up, once again, a framework for analysing media texts with a detailed model of how to answer all the questions in the framework. So that's all as a part of that. And then the kids do internal assessment 2 for that, which is the persuasive speaking. And once again, that's a pretty straightforward one. It's just a persuasive speaking, but we've offered some options for how you might approach it. One of the things, and there's both in Chapter 3 of the first book, as I said before, is the direct preparation for this particular assessment piece, there's a lot of stuff about persuasion and models of persuasive speeches, etc. One of the things that I did in this one, particularly with my, as I was writing this at the same time as I was finishing off my PhD thesis, which was about spoken speaking, is I've actually used some of what I learnt there to actually pull apart, Malala, I can never remember her, yes, thank you, and her speech that she did, and it actually looks at her use of paralanguage, that is gestures, facial expression, etc., in sync with the language, and pulls that apart in a fair bit of detail. Now, I can only unfortunately include a little snippet, but it gives people a model for how they might, look at more of it as well. So it really, and if you want to hear more about that, I'm actually going to talk more about the spoken tasks at the state conference this year and teaching spoken tasks. It'll be applicable to YA2 and your state conference, I'm talking as Vice President of ETAC now, your state conference program should be in the mail when you arrive home if you're an ETAC member, because it arrived at my place state. Well, you probably know. Toowoomba should get the same day as Brisbane, surely.
Oh no, it'll probably
you don't think so?
days.
All right. Well, look out. Okay, so look out for it in the mail. There we go. Yeah. Any questions about Unit 3? Okay. And yeah, look, I've made the point before. We tried to use a wide range of texts, particularly from the prescribed list. There's some of them. What we did do, which I'll talk more about in a moment, is there are study guides for all 8 of the external exam texts. So they're all covered. They're all covered. We knew that people wouldn't forgive us if we didn't do that. We're not stupid. Yeah. And look, this is really simply here to say that we've really looked closely at what the syllabus requirements are, and we've made sure that we've covered all those requirements as part of what we've put into the book. Unit 4, of course, is where the rubber really hits the road in terms of the new stuff for us with the external exam. Chapter 10 is a close study of short stories. Now, the short story collection which Sophie chose to focus on was Ireland. I can't remember the author of it, but it's set in Cape Breton in Canada. And has a bit of a, sort of islandy, but rural at the same time, and fishing sort of theme may not be too, relevant to some of the kids up here, perhaps. Or, maybe they'll like reading about somewhere exotic, and someplace exotic. And then Chapter 11 deals with internal assessment 3, the creative response, and it models, it takes through doing a text that is both a narrative intervention or a narrative that is a springboard from a text. So it's taking both those options into account. Topic 2 is obviously the external exam chapters, which we've had to be really careful with, as you can imagine. Now, I have talked... actually, I'll get to that when I talk about the external exams itself. As I said, we've provided study guides to all those, but as well as that, what we've done is in Chapter 7 of this book, I actually set up a really detailed framework for reading complex texts. In the book, I actually used a fantasy book written by an Australian author, Lady Helen and the Dark Days Club, but set up a framework for how to actually look at narration, characters, story world, plot, themes, etc. And that's done in a lot of detail in this book. In Chapter 12, I did a summary of that framework. so that it's still there, and there's actually a table which sums up the framework with all the associated questions to go with that. So what we've really tried to do is really lead kids through the process in a very detailed way in book 1. In book 2, we've really taken seriously the spirit of the syllabus, and that is that kids need to be independent by the time they get to topic 2 in Unit 4. And so we haven't set these study guides out as like Spark Notes. But what we have done is used the reading frames and the reading complex text framework and got key questions under all the headings to really help the kids develop a deep and thorough understanding of the text which they're reading. They have to find the answers though. The good news is the answers, or at least tips to the answers, will be provided in the teacher notes that accompany the book, so you'll have access to those, so you don't have to read the book. You can just, no, I'm not saying that at all. Of course you have to read the book or the play, whatever it is. So we've really taken seriously the fact they do, and I know that the independence thing is something which everyone's saying their kids are struggling with. So I assume that's probably no different up here. Yeah.
Even more true, I think.
Even more true? Oh, everyone tells me that, though, I have to tell you. And once again, Unit 4 does pick up on the syllabus requirements that have to be built up. So what we have done is made sure we build around the syllabus requirements. They are based around specific text, but the text can be a focus or used as models alongside the text you chose for your schools. And I put together this slide after Kelly got some questions in the first little workshop we ran, and that is that even if you completely ignored the chapters that had books that you weren't using, so in worst case scenario that you decide I'm not even going to look at those chapters because they don't use my books, so you're not even thinking about using them as models, these are the chapters you would still want to use out of book 2 because they've got that more general applicability. So yes, there are a small number of chapters which you might want to say we're not going to use them, but there's also a larger number of chapters where you will still want to use part or all of that chapter. And I would suggest that our external studies chapters are really spot on.
Nothing about poetry?
There's poetry built in there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, one of the chapters that Kelly wrote uses what's her name? The woman from the Marshall Islands.
Kathy Jetner.
Yes, Jetner Kilner uses her poetry alongside Hidden Figures, I think it might have been. Okay. Yeah. So there's definitely poetry in there. And in book 1, my writing the environment chapter has a heap of poetry in it. Yeah. So there's bits and pieces you can use all over the place. Yeah. Okay, so we know there's change head. I've talked about some of this already, and I mean, you know that 25%, which is, can I say, once again, the other states were really intrigued to find out that that was how we were doing it. They said, oh, aren't you using that final test as the scaling test? And I said, no, it's just 25, 25, 25, 25. So I think that's another thing we're probably going to be fairly grateful that, we've got. It's a reasonably sensible thing. This slide is here. Why? Oh yes, just because that's where those assessment pieces are covered, all that, so I can skip over that pretty quickly. This is how we have tried to cover those for assessment pieces. So I talked about the compositional analysis as a stepping stone to the external exam. That one is adaptable to screen or print, can adapt the language to suit different contexts. spoken persuasive response, adaptable for live recorded, and I talked about that. And there's other models of persuasive speeches, once again in chapter 3 as well, for that. And links to the videos of those as well. Narrative intervention I've talked about, so we've got both things covered there, the narrative intervention or the short story springboarding from text studied, and then this here now. This is the bit which I want to emphasise. I've spoken about this numerous times, and at least a couple of times it's been in front of people who are part of the QCAA English team, including Lisa Bottomley. What I'm about to say, I have given her the opportunity to correct or challenge or whatever she wanted to do, and nobody has ever taken up that opportunity. All right, so I feel fairly confident that we've gone down the right track with what we've done here. So there's, you're doing analytical essay. The trouble is when you look at the work that the systemicists have done, analytical essay is not a genre which they talk about. In fact, there's a series of genres which are in the analytical part of their genre tables, and I should add that those genre tables actually I think are in your book in chapter 1. Yes, so the genre table is actually there on pages 8 and 9, and these are the genres that we've been working with across the two books. So you'll see that in the response to text genres, kids can do reviews, character analysis, so they're things which they're more likely to do in the junior school. Then they do compositional analysis, right, which is what I suggested be the IA1 task. Then they do what I'm going to call analytical essay, but in brackets, interpretation. And that is based on the fact that when you look at the examples of analytical essay which QCAA has provided in the past, they're very much the interpretation style where you're saying this is the meaning that I would take from the text, based on some specific question or task that's been posed. And but when you look at those tasks, you might have heard me, has anyone heard me talk about this before? Because I don't want to bore everyone, but because I've talked about this at the masterclass and that, but when you look at the tasks, what you recognise is that what this interpretation style analytical essay requires is a invited reading of the text. So it's based on invited reading of the text. Where my concern, so I might add that in chapter 7 of this book then, the second half of that was a really detailed look at the interpretation style analytical essay with a model pulled apart, etc., etc. So that's all there in detail, and it's summarised again in that final external exam chapter. But what has been concerning me for some time, and I don't think this mistake will be made with the next book list, I might add, but the book list for the external exams is very white. It's in fact mainly British. There are no Indigenous authors represented, which for me was pretty shocking in 2019 that would happen. And yet we're going to have a very diverse range of kids sitting in front of us in classrooms. I assume up here as well, I can say that. And there's going to be stuff in there where, what are we going to force kids to make invited readings to conform with some, white way of looking at the world or Anglo-Saxon way of looking at the world. So what I was pretty keen to put in, and this, I can't remember whether this is there, but it does say that in the syllabus they want kids to write a critical essay. So there's the final type of text response genre is the critical evaluation or critical response style of analytical essay. And so what I've done is I've provide an example of what that might look like for The Great Gatsby, provide a detailed analysis of that critical response style. And I think the added advantage that it does is it doesn't just allow kids to make a resistant reading to the novel, then, if that's what they want to do, and gives them a really clear framework within which to make that resistant reading, but it also means that kids have options for how they might write the analytical essay, and we're not teaching them some sort of formula. Now, of course, you might make the decision that for the first go round you all want them to use a formula, but that may or may not work. So from a social justice perspective, I thought it was really important to give kids the opportunity to either be able to produce an invited reading of the novel or to produce a resistant reading of the novel, and provide them with some really clear frameworks for how they might do those two things.
So are you talking about identifying that in your contention or in your hypothesis? Like
Yes.
identifying the invited
Yes.
reading you believe has been constructed in the text?
Yeah, well, that's what
Or
you
believe it's
that's
present
what
in
you
the
do
text,
for the analytical essay. That's right.
And that would be what you, even though you've got analytical essay and critical evaluation separately, that would be
They're
your
both
expectation.
they're both analytical essays,
Okay.
though. Yeah.
Yeah, but that would be your expectation as to what they would
Yeah,
be
that's
looking
right.
for based on the fact that
That's
no one
right.
said that's wrong.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And the critical response model that I've put in, which
Yeah.
I wrote based on Gatsby, is based on research on how people write critical response style essays.
Okay.
Yeah. So, there's work already been done on that.
Yeah.
And I just tagged off that, but converted it to something that kids might be able to write for. And I chose The Great Gatsby, I might add, because it's not one of the external exam books, because we didn't want to privilege one book over another. And we didn't want kids to copy something and use something that was in our essays, with the external exams. We didn't think that would look good. And we also thought Great Gatsby, if the kids don't know it, the teachers are going to know it and would be able to lead kids through it as well pretty easily. And lots of kids, I've discovered, still do Great Gatsby at some point anyway. So even if it's not an external exam one, lots of them will be familiar. Any other questions about that? If you want me, look, there's a lot more to say about that. I've delivered a number of workshops and a couple of master classes for ETAC on the two different styles of essays. So if you want to talk to me more about that, we can talk about more at the end.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Anything else? Just making sure I'm sticking to time here. I think we've covered most of the big stuff. I must say, I don't know what it is, but ETAC's just produced a book with the yellow cover too, but there is something about yellow covers, I've decided, which are quite eye-catching. So, yeah, quite nice, the yellow cover, I think. Look, these ones here, they're more, for more general information that you might want to have a look at. Yes, a couple of things I need to point out. One is that there is a toolkit at the end which has frameworks and templates and that for you. We only get about 12 pages for those though, so there's not masses of them, but they do cover each of the IAs and the external exam with some checklists which kids can use for peer and self-evaluation as well, based on the criteria from the syllabus. There's those frameworks for comparing and analysing text. There's note-making and inferring guide. So, for example, there's a Cornell note-taking template in there, and a couple of others, and then those planning templates and assessment checklists. So they're all blackline master types, and if you have the class sets and you've got access to the electronic version, you can download them as PDFs as well. Look, I've really done most of this, but just very quickly, you'll notice that each of the whole book set out very consistently. The whole series is, so you get focused questions, explicit syllabus alignment, listed text, particularly linked to the prescribed text list at the beginning of each chapter. then you've got really clear sections marked and numbered. You also get your turn activities where it's kids can go off and do their own work associated with that. And I should point out that's where the higher order stuff goes. And then there's additional links in that as well. There's also, we've tried to use, as I said, consistent transferable frameworks throughout the book. There's margin glossary, and at the back there's a full glossary covering all the terms that were covered in the book. And sometimes those glossary items, for space reasons, are a little bit longer than ones that actually appear in the margin. And then graphic organisers, tables, flowcharts, etc., etc. Try to make the books at least look interesting. And I think that's where I turn over to someone from Oxford.